HART board meeting today. If I may, I'm going to begin the call to order, and let's begin with our Pledge of Allegiance. Stand if you're able to do so, and begin with the pledge. I pledge allegiance to the flag of the United States of America and to the republic for which it stands, one nation, under God, indivisible, with liberty and justice for all. Roll call, please. Are we doing a roll call, or if
I did record attendance, but I can do a verbal roll call if you would like, Chair.
Sure.
Okay. Chair Vieira,
Here.
Director Owen,
Here.
Director Williams indicated she would be absent. Director Cameron Cepeda, Director Hartfield,
Present.
Director Henderson, Director King,
Here.
Director Knight,
Here.
Director Mechanic,
Here.
Director Myers,
Here.
Director Schisler, and Director Wolstall.
Here.
Thank you very much. And we don't need a quorum today, but just for whatever sake. Okay, so let's first go to public comment and public input. If anyone is here, if we have anyone registered for public comment? Okay, none. Okay. So I will now, if I may, turn the meeting over to turn this presentation over to Miss Lisa Bakut, Executive Director of the Florida Public Transportation Association. Go ahead, ma'am.
Thank you so much. There we go. Thank you so much. My name is Lisa Bakut. I'm the Executive Director of the Florida Public Transportation Association. I've been the director there for 12 years. I'm really excited to be asked to come down here today to hear and participate in the workshop. So thank you all for the invite. I wanted to talk just very briefly. You obviously you have the agenda before you, but I know that this is the first time the board has really heard from Michael Baker International to discuss the organizational and structure study analysis. As you guys know, last year, House Bill 1397 passed the legislature and was signed by the governor in June of last year. And that bill asked the DOT to work with a consultant and have this study done. So that's what we're here to discuss today, obviously. I did want to note that the study was merely to provide options to you as the board. It was not to provide recommendations. So when you hear from Michael Baker, they're going to talk about their options and scenarios that they found after the analysis. We're going to start, of course, with Arian Franklin, who is the Associate Vice President with Michael Baker International. He is going to go through the governance and operational management analysis that they conducted. Michael Baker International is a great firm, great reputation here in the state of Florida, so I think your DOT did make an excellent choice, and I felt like the report itself had some great information in it. After that, we're going to have Jeffrey Booth, who's with Booth Transit Consulting and also a part of your HART legislative team. So he'll be here discussing some of his experience with other entities that have gone through a similar process. And then we'll just have kind of an open discussion after that. I know you all realize this is a workshop. No action can be taken, no motions. This is just mostly for your information and for you all to get some information and clarification on the analysis that was completed. So thank you again for inviting me. I will turn it over to Arian Franklin.
And if I may, ma'am, just so that the board knows roughly, I'm not going to hold you to it, how long will both presentations take roughly?
Arian. 20 minutes. And
Okay.
Then Jeffrey.
Okay, good. So I just wanted to establish that before. So I would ask board members to not ask any questions during the presentations and to let them obviously finish both before going on with questions. And something I was going to say before, and it slipped my mind, was that, again, we do want to emphasize that this report was to find not recommendations, but options. So just for everyone, you can obviously ask them the question, what is your recommendation? But they're not going to be able to answer it, so probably not the best thing to ask. So thank you, ma'am. Go ahead.
Yep.
Good afternoon, everybody. Thank you very much for the opportunity to work with your agency on this report. It's great to learn more about HART, and I think it's a very great organization. And I'm going to briefly run through the report. I know I said 20 minutes, so I will do my best to exceed that expectation. So I'm going to talk very briefly about our initial observations and then I'll go through the governance scenarios that we put in the report. In terms of our initial observations, one, we think the organization is well-led. So it's great to have the opportunity to meet with Scott and the leadership team. And at every interaction that we had with the existing leadership team, we have nothing but positive things to say. We did look at the board structure. So as part of our study, we tried to compare HART to peers that we identified from around the country. We did try to focus on ones here in the region, ones that you would have an opportunity to be able to look at, as opposed to some that were located, let's say, on the West Coast. So we did identify a number of peers. They're outlined in the report. And as part of our analysis, we looked at both national trends as well as how HART compared to those peers that we identified. We also did a number of interviews. So we conducted 21 interviews with some of your board members, as well as with local officials, planning organizations, as well as some of the other transportation organizations here in the region. And all of that information is what went into our analysis. So one of the things we looked at was the board structure. And we found that your existing board is, with the current size of the board, is comparable to other organizations in transit. Slightly higher, but still within range, right? We found that national average is about 10 board members. You guys are slightly larger than that. But there were some concerns about the language, which would require the board to keep growing if the population, as the population continues to grow. And we'll talk a little bit more about that in the governance scenarios. We thought that operations here at HART were really great in terms of, especially when we look at the recovery post-pandemic, that one of only 7 agencies to return to us pre-pandemic ridership levels that of Tier 1 agencies across the nation. That's quite an accomplishment. We found, especially considering some of the other constraints that we found, and we'll talk about those briefly, that the operations were well aligned with transit best practices. In terms of assets, that was one of our concerns, is that it's, especially some of your physical assets, some of your capital assets were not in a state of good repair, especially your heavy maintenance facility. Compared to other organizations of your size and with your ridership level, we saw that as a challenge going into the future. Again, we can talk a little bit more about that when we get through the governance scenarios, but it is closely related to the next one, and that's our financial analysis. We found that compared to your peers, that HART's not funded at the same level of the peers that we looked at, both nationally and of the peers specifically identified for this study. Significantly less than those peers, which again leads to that asset comment that I made a few moments ago. It's hard to keep your assets in a state of good repair when you don't have the funding to keep up with that. With that, I'm going to go into the governance scenarios that we recommended. Not recommended, I'm sorry, the governance scenarios that we developed. And keep in mind that we tried to develop those scenarios to cover a wide range of possible alternatives for this body to consider. We weren't making a specific recommendation. We were looking at what are other popular or feasible governance scenarios across the nation, and how might they align with the unique situations here in Tampa. So the first one we called status quo with optimization, and it basically says to keep things the way they are, right? That the organization has made the changes necessary in terms of the leadership team, and that it could continue as is with no significant legal changes. We did have some optimizations that we listed in the report. For example, as I mentioned, the board structure earlier in my comments, that we thought that this body could address that unlimited growth potential, right? That as population continues to grow, that your board would continue to grow aligned with that. We also talked about the need for a comprehensive operational analysis, and that's basically a study that looks at how do you meet the needs of your ridership. Your last operational analysis was done before the pandemic, prior to 2019, and we thought that it would be a good time for you to refresh that as things have changed, right? As underlying drivers of transit demand have changed since 2019, and likely your ridership patterns and the need for transit has probably shifted throughout your service area. So it would be a good time to look at a COA, and then the last one being a transit development plan, which again would be basically how do you implement that COA's changes, right? So it's a financial plan, an operational plan to help figure out what system refinements do we make to better align with the current situation. The second governance scenario we outlined was to dissolve and rebuild. That is a very challenging scenario to talk through, but it has happened throughout the history of transit across the nation. And basically what it happens is the agency basically ceases to exist in its current form and a new agency is created. In every instance where that has happened, it has primarily been due to financial reasons. So probably not exactly the situation where HART is, right? But I mean, if you look at the report itself, it outlines several instances across the nations where agencies were dissolved and rebuilt. I will also stress as we talk about these scenarios that each one of these has gone through a legal review, and in the report, the full legal review is available. There are some excerpts as you read through each scenario next to it that we thought were interesting tidbits that kind of point to whether it's feasible or not for HART. But would recommend that as you go through and reread the scenarios that you do take a look at the full legal review. The third scenario that we talked about was formal partnering. HART has some existing partnering agreements. For example, you have an agreement with PSTA in terms of a joint powers agreement. Basically what we what we outlined in that scenario was that HART could, in some instances, improve operations by partnering with other agencies who may have shared missions, and then in cases, you could find some efficiencies. I will give you an example, human resources. Both agencies, for example, PSTA and HART, both hire operators, both hire maintainers, both hire other administrative professionals, that maybe there's opportunities through an agreement that you could share those responsibilities. You could partner and share those responsibilities. That is just one functional area where that type of a partnership could exist. Could also have partnerships for things like procurement, where you're purchasing like items. A partnering agreement may find some synergies there and opportunities for efficiencies where purchasing in larger quantities may save both organizations or multiple organizations capital dollars or operational dollars. The next one was a city or county governance model, and that's not uncommon in public transportation. We've seen transit agencies across the United States where the CEO reports to a county executive or a mayor, and then it has its advantages and disadvantages, which we outline in the report. But imagine that the biggest advantage is that all of the resources of that city or county are aligned under one chief executive, and that person could direct efforts among multiple organizations. So for example, if HART was looking at the need for sidewalks to get to and from transit stops, if the highway department or the roadway department reported to the same chief executive, they could just direct that effort as opposed to an authority making a request through a city or county government. It does have its disadvantages as well. Again, we outline a number of those in the report. Obviously, independent authorities have much more independence to be able to take the actions necessary to advance their mission. And the next one is privatization. I do want to stress this before we talk about privatization that we all know that public transportation is not an endeavor that makes money. It is a service that's provided to the citizens of your service area, and privatization often includes a private organization coming in with some type of a profit-making model. However, in some areas, it works. So in the scenario, we outlined several places where organizations have contracted some type of a private company to come in and provide transit service. It's typically overseen by a board or overseen by a small administrative staff and a board to be able to steer that private entity to provide, again, for the citizens of the jurisdiction. But again, it is a difficult model to sustain. There's not a lot of profit to be made in transportation, in public transportation in particular. So again, a model that's difficult, but again, we outline the potential positives and negatives in the report. We are almost done going through the scenarios. The next one is to merge with another agency. And this has been widely studied, in particular in relationship to HART and PSTA. And basically, a merger would be dissolving two agencies and then creating one new agency. It has a number of legal challenges that would have to be overcome to get there. But in essence, it would accomplish the same outcomes as the Joint Powers Agreement, but would create one agency with one leadership team as opposed to two leadership teams. And we outline a number of the positives and negatives in the report. And then the last scenario that we talked about is an intergovernmental governance or a regional transit authority. And the one example that we referenced is the ATL Link, which is in Atlanta's area. It is one of the most recently formed regional authorities, and it's slightly different than the regional authorities that this region has had in the past. And one of the things that ATL Link features that is not found in a number of other regional authorities is that it has a funding mechanism tied to it. So while it doesn't take away from any of its individual members' ability to use its federal funds to make decisions within their own jurisdiction, as it looks at regional projects or anything that would cross jurisdictional boundaries, ATL Link has a vote in that process, and it has a funding mechanism to basically enforce its decisions, right? So imagine in Atlanta region, if there's going to be a route that covers multiple counties and is going to touch that local option gas tax that is their funding mechanism, that ATL Link would have a vote above and beyond what those independent transit agencies would have. However, if, say, MARTA in Atlanta just wants to advance a project within Atlanta and it's only going to use its own funds, it doesn't need ATL Link's permission to do that. So kind of like your previous regional authority, but with some teeth behind it and truly just a focus on those regional projects as opposed to all projects. Those are all of the scenarios that we included in our report. Hopefully I did that in under 20 minutes. And I'm going to turn it over to Mr. Booth to talk more about board composition.
Thank you, sir. We appreciate you.
Thanks, Aaron. And so my comments today are more based on, I've been around this transit industry for over 40 years. And so I've worked on all kinds of different systems around the United States. And so part of this is born from my observations of several of the communities that were identified in the report and my personal experience with several of the organizations that were referenced in the report, as well as my knowledge of the history of the transit program overall. And, you know, as he mentioned, one of your challenges is like your board's going to keep getting bigger under your current bylaws, given the growth of the Tampa region and the fact that we're adding new board members every 150,000. So that's a now problem as you look at growth in the region, is how you're going to address that growth. So the time is ripe to try to address that. Now, my experience in every other city I will talk about in a minute is that every one of those was driven by a political problem that needed to be solved. And so that is usually the impetus for why there's change, is because there's a political problem that's existing in the region or an opportunity that they want to create in the region that presently doesn't exist. So let's start with the ATL. I was engaged by the Deloitte firm directly with the chairman of the House Transportation Committee that created the ATL. And I was deeply involved in the development of the ATL, going to many workshops and sharing governance alternatives around the United States for them to consider as they formed. And I would make several personal observations. Yes, they have a funding source, but yet they've been not able to take advantage of the funding source because the state legislature would not pass the tax allowing them to raise that money. Number two, because each of the jurisdictions retain their own revenue source, they're only the city of Atlanta has ever raised their tax as they were allowed to do on a state law. All the other jurisdictions have failed so far. I mean, Gwinnett County failed, they're going to go again, but one of the conditions for Gwinnett County is that they retain all the money within the county rather than sharing money with MARTA or anybody else. And so while we create a regional planning agency, we don't necessarily create regional service that connects or that's integrated among the different jurisdictions. And so that to me is somewhat of a weakness of the ATL. And so in terms of its promise, it was, and then the other thing I would say, and I don't know if this is too political of a statement, but basically what happened is the city of Atlanta and Fulton County were on the menu. And what happened in creating the districts, they carved up the county as the most populous county and the city as the most populous city. And they carved them up into multiple districts to combine with suburban counties and suburban cities to dilute the control of the city of Atlanta and Fulton County, who are the most populous city and most populous county in the region. And, and this happened at a time that the mayor of this Atlanta, there was a transition period, and the board chair, there was a transition of the CEO of MARTA. And so this happened in a bit with MARTA not at the table, really paying attention to what was happening. And so, I mean, that's just my observation, having been involved in that effort, that's partly why how the sausage was made and how the sausage ultimately got made in the Atlanta region. Let's talk about city and being part of a city or a county. So I do work for Charlotte Area Transit System, which is an agency of the city of Charlotte. So they report to the mayor and they report to city council. Every general manager who's ever been hired by CATS wants to create a regional transit authority. Their way to resolve the politics in the region to express the concerns of the North County mayors of Mecklenburg County that are not part of the city of Charlotte was to create the Metropolitan Transportation Commission, in which the chair of the MTC rotates every year between a suburban mayor and the city of Charlotte. But the challenge now, they want to create the Silver Line, the light rail system around the region. And North Carolina is a Dillon Rule state, if you're familiar with that, which means that you have to have the approval of the legislature to raise the tax at the local level. And so they've been unable to get the authority from the state legislature to raise that tax. But they want to create a regional system. So the mayor of Charlotte now realizes that in order to have the Silver Line be built, she's got to create a regional system. And so this is generating lots of conversations. And so I gave her some options, sort of citing, because they have the same problem that we had in Portland, Oregon, the Tri-County Metropolitan Transportation District, where they use a payroll tax there to pay for the system. And what they did is they carved out portions of Washington County and McClackams County, which were the suburban counties, who wouldn't get TriMet service, but in exchange, they wouldn't be taxed. And part of the problem they have is going to Gaston County is that all Gaston County doesn't support having the light rail system come to the city, but the city of Gaston does, or Gastonia does. And so trying to figure out how to solve that political problem for them, to get them on board to support the extension of the Silver Line to Gastonia, that's the nut they're trying to crack right now, is figure out how to go forward with that. So just an observation as you're looking at that, there are issues. You need to walk through the political issues as you try to work through those issues and make decisions. Privatization, understanding that every transit agency in America was private until 1964. In 1964, when all those systems were going bankrupt, Congress passed the Urban Mass Transit Act that for the first time provided federal support for transit. And that's the structure we have today, is the Urban Mass Transit Act. The challenge with that, not to get a constitutionalist here, but it was done under the Public Welfare Clause, where highways is on the Interstate Commerce Clause. And so it hurt us from making our case for transit at the federal level to be under the Public Welfare Clause, arguing that those opponents would say, oh, you don't have an impact on interstate commerce, versus highways, which is part of the Interstate Commerce Clause, where they could argue, we impact the interstate commerce. But we know that people cross boundaries, they cross state boundaries to get the work. So it's a weakness or an Achilles heel of the program to date, is that of how we are founded, but we were founded because we were an agency of the Department of Housing and Urban Development, and they carved out UMTA, the Urban Mass Transit Administration, out of HUD, and so that's kind of the history of the program and why we are where we are today going forward. But the issue with privatization is a lot of folks privatize bus service. It's very common. And so in Charlotte, the way they do their bus service is they have a private company operate all their buses. And that's a very common scenario around the United States, to have a private bus operator. And as the report indicates, there's strengths and weaknesses to that decision. So you have to really walk through, is that really cost effective? Is it really what we want? And do we want the bus drivers not to work for us, but to work for the private party? Where you have less control, so you're basically managing a contract as opposed to managing an agency. So those are the trade-offs you make in going private versus public. On mergers, I represented the Hampton Roads Transit, which is the creation of the Tidewater Regional Transit and Peninsula Kent Transit in the sort of Norfolk, Virginia Beach area. And this was driven because they wanted to have a regional agency, and they thought the transit could be the start to really build regionalism and to really sort of merge both sides of the James River to really have integrated transit service, because people were crossing those boundaries, just like people cross the bay here every day to go to work. How can we bring those two parts of the region together? And so it was a long ordeal. It took about 3 to 4 years for that actually to happen until they actually created Hampton Roads Transit. Once again, kind of like as I talked earlier about that what the concession made to those individual jurisdictions was that you didn't have to pay for services outside your jurisdiction. Why does that matter? So if you've ever been to Norfolk, the Norfolk Light Rail line stops at the boundaries of Virginia Beach. Why? Because Virginia Beach never wanted to pay for light rail service into the beach. And so right now, light rail only operates within the boundaries of the city of Norfolk and can't go any further because none of the other jurisdictions are willing to pay for it. In addition, people complain about the bus service there, but that's because, you only get as much bus service as your city is prepared to pay for. And so it creates uneven service across the region because you're not funding it at the same level and you're not looking at it regionally. You're looking at it just from the context of your city and what benefits my city. So in closing, my observations, none of these are panaceas. They all have pros and cons you need to weigh and consider. There are good places to look at. I can suggest other places to consider peers around the United States. I currently working on governance agreements in other parts of the country right now, so sort of walking through these issues and weighing these trade-offs as you begin to sort of walk through the model that you want to employ. But I do see, number one, 2 observations in closing. One, truly we've got to say, what is the problem we're trying to solve? What are we trying to address? What's the ultimate goal of trying to go through one of these efforts to sort of reconstitute HART? That's one big question. The second is, it's been true ever since I've been representing HART. For those who don't know, who didn't hear me this morning, I started working with HART as a client in 1995. They've been a client for almost 30 years. So I have lots of history working in Tampa. So I have lots of perspective that comes from those 30 years. And I think the one perspective that I have that is a constant is we never have enough money. And money has always been a challenge for this region to come up and being able to grow transit, because it's been always hard to get support to pass the tax. And I helped draft some of the referendum language in 2010 with Hillsborough County. I was at the table with Hillsborough County as we were trying to work and arguing for looking at other revenue sources for HART. So I've been around this issue in the Tampa region for a long time. And so I have perspectives that come from being here for a long time. With that, I close.
Thank you very much, sir. We appreciate you. Is that it with presentations? Okay, great. Thank you very much. We appreciate really wonderful presentations, and I know we have a lot of people who came here also. Wanted to acknowledge Mr. Ming Gao with FDOT, who's been there for almost 30 years, and a USF graduate and a very nice gentleman. It's always a pleasure to work with him, and we appreciate you being here, sir, as always. So we'll begin with questions and comments from board members. And for those of y'all out there in the virtual world, just push your hand up feature, and if for some reason you can't work it, just wave at me. So who would like to go first? I can speak, or if somebody, Chair always, Commissioner Myers, go ahead, ma'am.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. We continue to hear that we're an underfunded agency. So here we're hearing it again from another study. What are we going to do as a board to bring this to fruition, and we stop talking about it, but we find a way that we can fund HART? Mm-hmm. Because in order to do some of the things that's mentioned in this report, it requires funding.
Yeah.
Okay? So I think that's one of the things that we need to talk about.
Yes, ma'am.
And what do we have in place to make it happen? Thank you.
Thank you, ma'am. Anyone else? Councilman Schisler, go ahead, sir.
Thank you, Chair. To that point, Ms. Myers, thank you very much for the lead-in. This is one of the efforts that we've been trying to put forward with the ad hoc alternative revenue source committee that we've been meeting with. We had a presentation several weeks ago from our lobbyists on things that were in the move and so forth with the legislature. And we are meeting, I believe, 2 weeks, Mr. Drainville, where we're going to be, the ad hoc committee meets Monday, next Monday.
The fourth Monday of the month.
Where we're going to be making some presentations to the ad hoc committee on what we feel are the most viable options moving forward to increase the revenue sources for the organization. And then once the committee comes back with a consensus, bringing it before the board so that the board can yay or nay or whatever, and then move it on to the various agencies within the realm, the region that we need to get approvals for to make this happen. So I agree with your point wholeheartedly. And I've been saying this for the 5 years that I've been on here, that as one of the oldest, the longest tenured members of the board, I see this year in and year out. The fiscal constraints and the fiscal issues are like a sword of Damocles hanging over our head all the time. So, but the report, I like the report. It's some very good information for us to consider and, move forward and get HART to the place where it needs to be within our region. Thank you.
Thank you, sir. And on President's Day, I recognize the gentleman with President Reagan behind him. Commissioner Owen, go ahead, sir.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. Yeah, I guess, one of the things I want to be careful of is the reason kind of why we're doing this. We understand the funding issues that we have with HART. The legislature understands it. And I want us to be very careful using it as a platform to come up with another tax on Hillsborough County, which is not going to fly, is a way for us not to survive. I think that, and I'm not saying that's what the lead-in is to it, but that is probably Exhibit A of how not to survive. We got to figure out that the answer, I think, to that first question is the reason we're doing this is for the preservation and the survival of HART. And I think the way to fail is just to say, hey, we just need more money. And it may be something that's very difficult to figure out. I mean, I look across the pond now and I look at Pinellas, they've got their own issues they're dealing with now, And it's like, okay, merger looks like something that we could consider, but now that I see the problems that they're having, that doesn't necessarily look too appetizing to me. So, I'm using this as kind of a springboard for us to start this discussion on coming up with a solution for the legislature, because that's what they're expecting of us. I think they've been pretty clear on things we need to try to do or accomplish, and I don't see anything in there about a tax. Now, whether we can come up with some funding from the feds or even the state legislature, that would be great. But I do think that the way to fail for HART would be to say we're going to rely again on some type of transit tax, for light rail, which I'm not saying that's what's being proposed, but I really think we just need to be careful there. But I do appreciate the presentations. I think this is a great start, but we've got to come up with solutions to the legislature in response to that report on how we're going to do things different, really, and honestly, the way I look at it, to survive. So, thank you.
Thank you, Commissioner. Next is Commissioner Wosel, and then Board Member Hartfield. Go ahead, sir.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. And apologies for not being there in person. Seems to be a miscommunication. I thought that this was purely a web workshop. So I will say the last speaker, I am, now that I'm cognizant and aware that an individual with a history, while I appreciate all of the research and the presentations, but that an individual with personal history and involvement in advocating for taxes was involved in the report, I think that that's just a variable that I need to be extremely cognizant of moving forward, and maybe I need to reread it and frame my thoughts around that fact. I did want to ask the first consultant that spoke, I now forget his name, but I had a couple of questions about. It seems to me that some of the conclusions that were in those final bullet points were arbitrarily added in there, and I didn't understand how we got there, specifically the ones on merging with PSTA that Commissioner Owen just accurately pointed out, which is, with all due respect to them, they have a lot of challenges, and a lot more of their challenges were just testified to at the State House from some of their own local representatives, and I just don't understand why those conclusions were put into there, and how us merging with a 2 or 3 hour round trip bus across 275 is going to fix all of the woes that HART has. So I didn't know if there was some information in their report that I overlooked that they could point me to, or if they could elaborate on those specific conclusions on how they were drawn.
And yes, sir, Commissioner, he's coming up.
Thank you very much for your questions, Commissioner. I just want one point of clarification. Mr. Booth wasn't involved in the report itself. So from a study standpoint, he was not involved in the preparation of the report. So I just wanted to make sure we were clear on that. In terms of some of the specific things that were in the report, especially as it comes to the merger, it was actually in the bill language for us to examine that. So again, we weren't making recommendations on any of these scenarios. We were literally developing a la carte menu, for lack of a better term, of all of the possible considerations for this body to consider. And we weren't specifically making any recommendations. So I would not stand here and say that you should merge with another organization, whether it was next door or across the state. We were just trying to be responsive to the requests that were made in the bill language, as well as provide some context of how transit agencies across the United States and amongst that peer group have addressed similar governance challenges.
Okay, so my other question is, you guys were pretty clear that even though you were saying that while there are some accomplishments and challenges, it seems that you continued to reiterate, to point out that, even though you're comparing statistics and data, it's not considering all variables and that no two agencies are the same. So in the agencies that we were compared to, I'm trying to determine, are they as geographically dispersed and sprawling and filled with cattle ranchers and strawberry and blueberry farms and sod farms? Because I would imagine that those are some of the variables that while we say we might be 1,200 miles, I think it would be completely inaccurate to argue that we even attempt to service more than 10 to 15% of the acreage of Hillsborough County. Is that correct in your analysis? Were those variables considered?
I think that's a great observation, and if I could take a second to just talk about it. I don't think that there are two agencies in the United States that have identical geographical service areas. And I think as a person that does service development for transit agencies across the U.S., one of the first things we talk to not only their boards and their leadership team, but also their passengers and other stakeholders is that we try to say that the solution that we're going to put together for them has to be specific to that region. And I would say the same thing about the Tampa region, that the scenarios here, the characteristics of this service area are unlike any other service area in the United States. There would be no way for us to say quantifiably that you are identical to a JTA or a PSTA or any other agency nearby or across the nation. So I think it's very hard to account for the rural aspects of your service area as well as the urban aspects of your service area. That said, the challenges that go along with having a diverse geography are not unique. That almost every transit agency has some portion that is not like the rest of it. I mean, if we talk about, I'll use JTA, who was here in the state, in terms of land mass, Jacksonville is the largest city in the United States. terms of landmass. But it's not like Tampa. It's not like Hillsborough County. But it is very, I would hate to use the word sprawling, but it's a very large geography that has unique challenges. And just about every transit agency, no, not just about, every transit agency that I've ever worked with has some unique characteristics of its service area that makes it unlike every other one. So I would say it would be incorrect for me to say that these peer agencies are identical to you. What we tried to identify were ones that had attributes that we thought made some of the comparisons more relevant. And we tried to focus those comparisons on governance factors and not necessarily on service development factors, because that wasn't our charge. If we were looking at trying to redevelop, let's say this was a comprehensive operational analysis, and we were trying to compare you to another geography that had similar characteristics so that we could design a new transit system or make recommendations on how to look at your transit system, the list of peers would have likely been different. For example, we reference ATL Link in the report. I don't think that ATL Link would have been in our list of peer agencies if we were talking about service design. So hopefully I answered your question, Commissioner.
No, you're working me towards the direction that I'm thinking. Just, I think that I think some very good things, and we're here. The title of this workshop is board governance and structure. We kind of leapt into talking about all of a sudden increasing taxes, which was very confusing to me. I want to make that point clear that while we talk about restricted funding sources, that we have these comparisons that suggesting that we have low levels of funding. Well, we're not comparing necessarily fair variables where my friend that lives in Fort Lonesome, an hour and a half away from me in the same county, who will never, ever get service from HART, is taxed to pay for this service. So those are unique variables and characteristics that can go along with saying, hey, if we're only providing service truly to the major arteries in the east side of Tampa, and how do we get to improving those efficiencies and core competencies? How does this report help get us there to provide better service? I think that it is very dangerous for those comments in this workshop to have been brought up about strained funding sources. So I guess my final question, and thank you in the report for being complimentary to HART staff. I mean, they've gone through obscene challenges over the last several years for any organization to come out this positive on, I think is a testament to themselves. But when you say that we've reached pre-pandemic levels of ridership, you're only saying flat numbers, though. It didn't appear that you guys were accounting for record high influx of residents into the county, so on a per capita level, we would be down in terms of percentage of ridership. Is that fair?
That's a fair statement. If I could respond to 2 points really quickly, if that's okay.
Yeah.
So the first one, just on funding, I just wanted to make clear, the report doesn't talk about a new funding source. It just says that in terms of funding, and just to be a little more detailed than what I said in my opening comments, we looked at the 30 largest metro areas in the United States, and you ranked 29th out of 30 in terms of spending on transit. So again, of the 30 largest agencies in the U.S., you ranked at the bottom. I mean, there was only one that had a lower level. I mean, to the tune of about $100 million a year. So on average, $213 million a year was the average amongst those 30. And you guys were at about 114, so just about $100 million less. So I just wanted to make sure that the magnitude of what I was trying to express in terms of the funding level is significant. In regards to the per capita comment, you are spot on in regards to if we looked at it on a per capita level. However, if we look across the entire United States, there are only 7 agencies, 7 Tier 1 agencies out of all of the Tier 1 agencies, which are more than 100 across the United States, that have reached their pre-pandemic ridership level. And they don't all have the same growth that you've had. So on a per capita level, the commissioner's statement was 100% spot on, that per capita it is less than it was. However, it's still a major accomplishment, because there are organizations, transit agencies across the U.S. who have had similar population gains that have not recovered. And one of the major reasons we found it significant to say it in the report is when we look at underlying demands of transit factor, of transit, those are significantly down. I'll use one quick example. When we look at the typical downtown area across the United States, corporate holdings are generally down, which means that all of those other supporting businesses are also down. I travel quite frequently for business, and what I find is places where there used to be a Dunkin' Donuts or a Panera or a Starbucks, that there are less of them, because there's not as many people downtown in every city that I go to. So that means that those people who typically would take transit to get to those jobs no longer take transit to get there. So ridership across the nation is down. Again, over 95% of transit agencies across the U.S. have not reached, again, there's only 7 who have reached their pre-pandemic number. So again, I thought it was an accomplishment that was worth noting. Again, on a per capita level, the commissioner's comments are spot on that it would be less per capita than it was before.
Yeah, and thank you. And as I close and pass the mic here to my colleagues, I think that your last statement there is an extremely important revelation that we're going to have to think about on governing and improving HART's service to the customers that need it the most. Is that if that's true, that there's a national downfall of ridership and eligible constituency in terms of those corporate models that promote that ridership in downtown areas. I think that that's a huge revelation that I need to consider, and I hope that I've made the point clear, though, in when we're terms of funding levels and in comparison to geographic disparities. I think that that's an important variable for all of us to consider. So thank you very much for all your work on this.
Thank you, Commissioner. We appreciate you. Board Member Hartfield, go ahead, sir.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. So thank you for the presentation. A couple of things that kind of bubbled up for me as we look at a governance and operational management analysis. The first one is that the comments regarding leadership were glowing. The comment regarding governance, I didn't get a warm and fuzzy in regards to the presentation. I know there was one item that was noted that needed to be reviewed and followed up on, and that was board structure. And I think the exact words was an unlimited growth potential. So I think from a board governance standpoint, that is certainly an item that we will need to take a stronger look at. I know today is not a board meeting where we can direct action, but that is something I think that needs to be looked at in the future. The second thing is an operational analysis. There was one last completed in 2019, and there was comments regarding there needs to be one developed, given that was pre-pandemic reporting. So for me, that really kind of stuck out for me is that one, leadership for the organization. There were warm and fuzzies passed there. As it related to governance, I did not get those warm and fuzzies. So that's more of a rhetorical. I will not put you on the spot as it relates to that, but there were at least two items noted that I think the board needs to follow up on.
Thank you, sir. And I don't see anyone. Director King, were you going to?
I do have a question.
Yes, sir. Go ahead, sir. Oh, yeah, you may go. Go ahead.
Hi. Thank you for your presentation. It's very informative and instructive. I've been leafing through the binder here, and it's a lot of information to digest. I do have one question about areas of comparison that doesn't seem to be addressed, though. In terms of debt load and debt service, how much debt do these various transportation agencies carry? Do you know? Do we have any figures on that?
I can provide that later. I don't have it off the top of my head, but, I mean, we do have that information, and I can summarize it and provide it back to this body. I can send it through FDOT to Scott, if that's acceptable.
Okay, well, just as a question, do we know how much debt load and debt service we carry?
Ms. Clerk, do you want to, yeah, we have zero debt.
Zero. Okay, so we have zero debt. That, to me, puts us in a very enviable position compared with our comparative organizations in the state of Florida and nationally. It gives us a degree of flexibility that some of those other agencies may not have. Would you concur with that?
I do concur with that.
Okay. I would appreciate seeing your figures on the debt.
Absolutely, we can provide that summary. Is 2 weeks acceptable to get that back?
Certainly.
Okay, thank you.
Great. And, sorry, I thought you were coming. Now, I'll give my thoughts. I don't see any other hands raised or anything of that nature. You know, I always say that with this study that and I don't have any questions, by the way. I know you, yeah. I always say that with this study, we welcome it, and I think that anybody who supports HART and wants HART to be viable long-term should welcome this. I think that the main thing that caused this, I think, was a real chronic loss of confidence in HART with hit after hit after hit after hit with HART that got Tallahassee's attention. And, you know, like we've told Tallahassee and members have told Tallahassee, we welcome this because transparency is very important. No organization, doesn't matter how well funded it is, and I'll get to that, can go forward without having confidence of taxpayers that fund it. And I think right now we're doing so much better, thank God Almighty, when it comes to confidence, where we weren't there a while ago. And it has nothing to do with the people that are here who are working hard for HART. You know, there are obvious challenges, not going to go through that history, but I think that's the main issue that caused this all is transparency. You know, we look at a couple of options, and I'm just going from my notes here of things that I wrote down from the two really very wonderful presentations. You know, the whole dissolve and rebuild as an option, to me, that's just dead on arrival. For me, that's something where there's either legal issues or the core is so rotten that you must finish it and send in a flood, and I just don't see that. The privatization route, I've never supported that. Again, for me, myself and I've never thought that's a good option for organization like HART. I think it's bad for the working families that rely on HART. I think it's bad for the workers who work for HART, many of whom have put in 10, 20, 30 years of service. And I think it's bad for the folks who rely on HART's core critical services. You know, regionalism, there's a lot of folks with a lot of different mindsets on that. I have an open mind but I tend to favor local control on this. I think that a county regional or a county transit system is one that, for me, just makes sense, that is really geared towards our needs here in Hillsborough County. We talk a lot about governance and our structure. I think our structure is generally good. That's not great. That's not perfect, but I think it's generally good. And I think some of the things that the report pointed out as options with regards to structure make sense. But again, I think it points to the idea that our structure is good. The issue of funding, was mentioned in the report without talking about solutions or proposals for our funding challenge. I think I always like to use. There's terms always used, and I always say making bricks without straw. Remember in the book of Exodus. And I think that a lot of times HART is asked to make bricks without straw when it comes to meeting the transportation needs of folks who rely on us here in the county. But I think our two biggest issues that the report highlighted, number one, by virtue of beginning the report, is the issue of trust in HART, transparency for HART. And I think, again, on that, we're doing very well in terms of improvements. I know our CEO here, CEO Drainville, is, I think, doing a great job. He's a great face of HART. People have confidence in him. And again, I think he's doing a great job. And like I've always said, I think our board, we've seen, by the way, even today, some philosophical issues come up. A lot of the issues that we've had on this board over the last year aren't really philosophical as much as just right and wrong. Let's get it done. Let's get the car running. Let's get the engine repaired, and let's get this thing on the road. And that's not philosophical, and that's good to see. And we've really worked hard, and I think this board really, really deserves credit for that. But I think that, again, building trust is very important, and funding is something that is very, very critically important. We talk about looking at grants from Tallahassee, looking at grants from the federal government, et cetera, all very, very well taken. For me, again, building bricks without straw. I've always been a supporter of a dedicated revenue source one way or another. I know that's not something we're here to talk about. I have supported it in the past. But again, finding a long-term solution to the transportation challenges of HART is part and parcel of also trust and transparency, because you can't ask people for more money for HART's a mission without building trust and transparency. That's the way that I see it. So I do support more revenue, but as I always say, trust and transparency is also our biggest challenge, which we're meeting. I think we're doing a good job on it right now in terms of improvements. And I'm sure there are many, many more things that we can do to make HART better, and we'll continue to work on that. That's all I'm going to say for now. Anybody else? Anybody out there in the virtual world? Is that Nolan Ryan behind you, Commissioner Owen?
Yeah, it's when Bo Jackson hit him in the face, and then he came back and finished the game.
Nolan Ryan, God bless him. Okay, there you go. Okay, so no further comments, questions? Okay, so I then assume our step is, council, we don't have any options. Obviously, we're not taking motions, we're not taking any action. Is it proper to adjourn at this time? Everybody? Okay. Speak now or forever hold your peace. Okay.
What's the next step?
Well, next steps. Okay. Board, you know what? I'm so sorry. Next steps. Do we have, thank you, Councilman Schisler.
I think the next steps, it's in your court.
Yes.
As we just said, it's really in your court to continue to discuss this and decide what your next steps are. So I don't know if Mr. Drainville wants to comment on that, but that's, pretty much what I think.
I just want to thank you, Lisa, FDOT, Ming, and Arian to coming out. We asked you to come out, and you made all the effort to do that, so I want to thank you. So.
Board Member Myers, go ahead, ma'am.
Next step will be to place this item on the agenda at our next monthly meeting for
Yes.
discussion with the board.
Yep. So can we do that, council, in terms of just a request from the board and have that be on the next, we can do that?
You certainly can, and also remember, we are in the process of looking at your policies and
Yes.
providing revisions, most of which deal with transparency, management, governance, and oversight, to hopefully vitiate some of the issues we've had in the past. So I think some of those policies will be part and parcel of what you will do to address the issues you heard today.
Okay. So we do have, and thank you for that, Mr. Smith, so we do have, I'm sorry, Councilmember Schisler. Go ahead, sir. No, go ahead, please.
I just want to bring up one other comment. There were several references or recommendations regarding the COA. What is this? Is there something like that in the works?
Yeah, so we actually staff started working on finalizing the scope for the COA, so that's in progress now.
So we have initiated that, and that's something.
Yes.
That's good. That's good.
You can't hear Councilman Schlissel.
I'm sorry, I did turn on my mic. I was asking Mr. Drainville if he had done anything with the COA initialization, to which he responded he has started. It has started, and they're in the proposal stage.
Okay. So I would then assume the next step is to have this, then as Commissioner Myers wisely recommended, to have this item placed in our next board meeting in March for discussion, and we will discuss it further at that time. Any other proposals or steps from board members? Any thoughts, Mr. Drainville, at all?
I'm good, thank you.
Okay, thank you. Okay, there you go. So what I would urge board members to do is, obviously, right now, today, we can't make motions, et cetera, is to just, think further about the report with regards to any proposals that the board can contemplate and vote on when we meet again in March, so when it'll be on the agenda formally. Okay, great. We thank all of our presenters for speaking and for your very thoughtful presentations, and we thank all of HART for your work and all of the board members for your thoughtful discussion and questions. Thank you, everyone. This meeting is adjourned.
Thank you.